The restaurant was busy that evening. Soft lights hung from the ceiling, chandeliers glowing gently above rows of tables covered in white cloth. Conversations floated across the room, some loud with laughter, others quiet and serious. Plates clinked, silverware tapped, and footsteps hurried back and forth as waiters tried to keep up with the endless orders. In the middle of all this movement was Rachel, a young woman in her late 20s wearing a black vest over a white shirt. Her hair was tied back neatly, though a few strands had escaped and brushed against her tired face. She forced a polite smile as she carried plates from the kitchen to the tables, her body aching from the long shift. Rachel was a single mother. Every day felt like a battle between her responsibilities at work and her responsibilities at home. She had a little daughter, Emma, who was just 5 years old. Emma was the light of her life, the reason she pushed herself so hard, but raising her alone was far from easy. Rachel's husband had walked out before Emma's first birthday, leaving her to face motherhood without support. The nights had been long, the bills had piled up, and the loneliness had cut deeper than she ever admitted out loud. Now, working as a waitress at this restaurant was how she kept a roof over their heads. The pay was not much, but it was enough to buy groceries, cover rent, and sometimes, only sometimes, leave a little extra for Emma's school needs. Still, most days Rachel came home exhausted, her feet sore, her back stiff, and her heart heavy. She moved quickly from one table to another, balancing plates and glasses, always with the same smile she had trained herself to wear. To customers, she was just another server, someone to take their orders and clean their tables. Few noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she set down a glass. Fewer cared about the tiredness behind her smile. To most people, she was invisible. On this particular evening, she had already faced more than her share of unpleasantness. At one table, a couple had snapped at her for taking too long, even though the delay was in the kitchen, not her fault. At another, a man had made a rude joke at her expense, laughing with his friends as if she could not hear. She had heard. She always heard. But she stayed silent because she needed this job too much to risk talking back. By the time the clock passed 8, Rachel's body felt like it was carrying stones. Her apron was stained, her shirt clung to her from the warmth of the crowded room, and her throat was dry from repeating the same polite lines. "Good evening, what can I get for you? Would you like anything else?" "Thank you, have a good night." Over and over until the words felt robotic, yet inside her thoughts were far from robotic. She thought of Emma at home, probably curled up on the couch with the babysitter holding her worn-out teddy bear. She thought of the overdue bill waiting on the kitchen counter, the one she had not found the courage to open yet. She thought of how long she could keep going like this, always tired, always worried, always trying to be both mother and father. At that moment, a new guest entered the restaurant. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with calm confidence. He wore a simple shirt, but his presence drew attention without effort. He looked around, and when his eyes met Rachel's, she quickly straightened her posture and approached him with the same tired smile she gave every customer. "Good evening, sir," she said softly. "Would you like a table for one?" He nodded. His voice was deep but kind when he replied, "Yes, thank you." Rachel led him to an empty table near the corner of the room. As he sat down, she handed him the menu and promised to return shortly. There was nothing unusual about him at first glance. To her, he was just another diner, another order, another plate to serve. But something about the way he looked at her lingered in her mind. His eyes were not dismissive, not hurried, not full of the impatience she was used to. They seemed steady, observant, almost as if he could see past her uniform and the rehearsed smile. She shook off the thought and returned with a glass of water. "Here you go," she said, placing it gently on the table. "Would you like a moment to look at the menu?" "Yes," he said simply, giving a small smile. Rachel nodded and turned away, moving on to other tables, but she found her mind drifting back to him. Why did he look at her like that? Why did it feel different? As the minutes passed, she continued her work, but the exhaustion pressed harder against her. Her legs ached, her back felt stiff, and her head throbbed faintly from the noise around her. Still, she kept moving. She always did. For Emma. Always for Emma. Eventually, the man placed his order. Nothing extravagant, just a meal for one. Rachel noted it down and hurried to the kitchen, delivering the ticket to the chef. Then she continued with her endless routine, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and checking on guests. but in the quiet moments between tasks, she caught glimpses of him. He did not seem in a rush, did not tap his fingers impatiently or glance around as if waiting for the world to move faster. Instead, he sat calmly, sometimes watching the room, sometimes watching her. And every time their eyes met, Rachel felt a strange warmth she could not explain. She did not know that this man had already noticed things about her that most people overlooked. He had seen the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking, the way her hands were slightly rough from long hours of work, the way her smile faltered for half a second before she put it back on. He had seen her struggle even in silence, but Rachel could not know that yet. For her, it was just another long night, another shift to survive. She carried the plates of food to his table when it was ready, setting them down carefully. "Here you go, sir. I hope you enjoy your meal." "Thank you," he replied, his voice carrying a gentleness that caught her off guard. She gave a quick smile and walked away, though something about his tone stayed with her. The night wore on. More guests came, more orders were placed, more plates carried back and forth. Rachel's body felt like it was breaking, but she pushed through. She always did, and somewhere in the middle of that tiring, endless night she thought again about Emma. Her sweet laugh, her tiny hands clutching at her sleeve, her little voice asking, "Mommy, when will you be home?" The memory gave her strength to keep moving, to keep smiling, even when her heart felt like sinking. Little did she know, before the night ended, something was about to happen that would stay with her forever. Something that would break through the tiredness, the routine, and the invisibility she had carried for years. The hours at the restaurant moved slowly, as if the hands of the clock were dragging themselves through heavy mud. Rachel carried on with her work, weaving between tables, balancing trays, and reciting the same polite lines she had spoken hundreds of times before. Every step reminded her of the long day she had already endured. She had woken up before sunrise to prepare Emma's breakfast, packed her little girl's bag, walked her to school, and then hurried to catch the bus that brought her to the restaurant. Now, late in the evening, her energy was nearly gone, yet her shift was not over. Not even close. That night seemed harder than usual. The customers were restless, more demanding, and more impatient than ever. At one table, a woman scolded Rachel for bringing her the wrong side dish, even though it had been exactly what the woman ordered. At another, a group of young men laughed loudly, leaving their table messy with crumpled napkins and spilled drinks, expecting Rachel to clean it all without a word of complaint. She did, of course. She always did. Her body ached as she bent and straightened, carrying plates, clearing glasses, and hurrying to the kitchen. Her mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. Emma's innocent smile, the overdue bills, the shoes she could not afford to replace, the broken washing machine at home that still sat unused because she had no money for repairs. The weight of all these worries pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe sometimes. Yet she kept moving. The restaurant was her battlefield, and she could not afford to surrender. In the middle of this difficult night, her eyes kept drifting toward the man sitting quietly in the corner. He was different from the others. While the rest of the guests tapped their fingers impatiently or spoke loudly into their phones, he sat still, calm, almost as if he were in no rush to leave. He ate slowly, and when Rachel came to refill his water, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold no judgment, only a kind of quiet understanding. "Thank you," he said softly, and Rachel found herself pausing for half a second longer than usual. The word was simple, but the tone carried a weight she was not used to hearing. It was genuine. Most customers treated her like part of the furniture, but this man had spoken to her as if she were human, as if he saw her. She quickly nodded, smiled politely, and moved on to the next table. Still, that brief moment stayed with her. She shook her head, trying to push the thought aside. It was silly, she told herself. It was just a customer being polite. She could not afford to dwell on such things. But as the night dragged on, her exhaustion deepened. At one point, when she returned to the kitchen to collect an order, her knees almost gave way beneath her. She steadied herself against the counter, inhaling deeply, her chest rising and falling with slow, shaky breaths. No one noticed. The other waiters were busy with their own tasks, the chefs too focused on the clattering of pans and the shouting of orders. Rachel stood there for a moment, invisible in the chaos, before straightening up and forcing herself back out into the dining room. When she returned to the man's table, she found that he had finished his meal. His plate was pushed slightly forward and his hands rested calmly on the table. Rachel approached with her usual polite tone. "Was everything all right, sir?" He looked at her and nodded. "Yes, thank you. It was very good." His eyes lingered on hers for just a second longer than she expected, and Rachel felt an odd warmth spread through her. She quickly glanced away, gathering the plate and silverware, before retreating toward the kitchen again. It was near closing time now. The crowd was thinning, but Rachel still had to clean tables, sweep the floor, and prepare the dining area for the next day. Her body screamed for rest. Her feet felt like they were made of lead, but she pushed on, moving automatically through the routine. As she was wiping down a nearby table, she noticed the man reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a pen and a piece of paper, and for a moment Rachel thought little of it. Perhaps he was writing down a number or making a note for himself. She turned back to her work, focusing on cleaning the glassware. But when she looked again, she saw that he was carefully folding the paper. Then as she passed by his table once more, he placed it gently on the edge along with the bill. Rachel blinked, surprised. It was not unusual for customers to leave notes, sometimes complaints about the service, sometimes unnecessary comments that she tried to forget as quickly as possible. Her stomach tightened with a familiar dread. She had been insulted before by words left on scraps of paper, comments about her appearance, her service, or her tired smile. What if this was just another reminder of how invisible she was, except when someone wanted to criticize her? Still, she picked up the folded note with trembling fingers. Her eyes hesitated before opening it, afraid of what she might read. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though the words written inside carried a weight she was not yet ready for. Before she could unfold it, she realized the man was still watching her. Not with impatience, not with judgment, but with a steady gaze that felt almost reassuring. Rachel's chest tightened. She quickly tucked the note into her apron pocket, unsure of whether she wanted to read it right there in front of him. She nodded politely and whispered, "Thank you, sir," before turning away. He gave a small nod in return, then stood up from his chair. His presence seemed to fill the space for a moment longer, and then he walked calmly out of the restaurant. Rachel found herself staring at the door even after it closed behind him. Something about the quiet way he left, something about the note still burning in her pocket made her heart pound. The restaurant grew quieter as the night drew to an end. The last guests paid their bills, chairs were pushed back into place, and the sound of laughter faded into the distance. Rachel finished wiping down the last table, her movement slow and weary. Then at last, when the room was nearly empty, she pulled the note from her pocket. Her hand shook slightly as she unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the words and her breath caught in her throat. Whatever she had expected, a complaint, a rude comment, or just a meaningless scribble, was nothing compared to what she found written there. It was not long, not even a full paragraph. Just a few simple sentences, but those sentences would stay with her forever. Rachel pressed her lips together, her eyes burning with tears she had been holding back all night. She lowered herself into a chair, clutching the note with both hands, reading it again and again as though the words might disappear if she let go. And in that moment, surrounded by the silence of the nearly empty restaurant, the difficult night began to change into something she would never forget. The paper in Rachel's hand trembled as though it carried more weight than its size could explain. The words written there had touched something deep inside her, something she had buried beneath years of exhaustion, worry, and survival. She read them again and again, her lips moving silently as if tasting the kindness woven into the sentences. The man who had been sitting so quietly in the corner was now gone, yet his presence still lingered in the air. She could almost feel his steady eyes watching her, not with the sharpness of judgment, but with the softness of understanding. The restaurant was nearly empty now, the laughter and noise from earlier replaced by the scraping of chairs and the clinking of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. Rachel sat at the table with the note pressed between her fingers, her throat tight and her heart pounding as though she had just run a long distance. She could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her in such a way. For years she had moved through life like a shadow, serving others, cleaning up messes, carrying burdens, and putting on a smile that felt more like a mask than an expression. And yet, in a few simple words, this stranger had managed to pierce through that mask and remind her that she was seen. Her mind wandered back to the moment she first greeted him. She remembered how calm he looked, how he spoke with a tone that felt genuine, how his eyes lingered on her without rushing past like everyone else's. He had noticed her, and not just the uniform she wore, not just the task she performed, but her, the woman behind the apron, the mother who carried her world on tired shoulders. He had been a silent observer all night, watching her without making her feel small, and now she realized that he had been paying attention in ways no one else had. Rachel's chest ached as she folded the note carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. She would read it again later. She knew she would, perhaps in the quiet of her small apartment after Emma had fallen asleep. For now, she needed to finish her work. With a shaky breath, she pushed herself to her feet and returned to wiping down the last of the tables. Yet everything felt different. The exhaustion was still there, but it no longer pressed on her in the same crushing way. The loneliness she carried every day was still present, but tonight it felt ever so slightly less heavy. The other staff moved around her, chatting lightly about their own plans for after work. One of the waiters laughed at a joke. The chef shouted a final order before removing his apron, and the dishwasher hummed faintly as he stacked clean plates. None of them knew what had just happened to Rachel. None of them could understand what it meant to her to receive a message that recognized her silent struggle. She kept it to herself, clutching the secret close to her heart as if it were a fragile flame she needed to protect. Later, when she walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air, the world seemed sharper somehow. The streetlights glowed brighter. The hum of passing cars sounded clearer and the night sky felt closer than usual. Rachel hugged her coat tighter around her and began the walk toward the bus stop. Her feet were sore, each step a reminder of the long hours she had worked. But her mind was alive with the memory of the note. She touched the pocket where it rested as though making sure it was still there, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. On the bus ride home, she leaned her head against the window, watching the city blur past. Her thoughts drifted to Emma. She imagined telling her daughter about the kind man in the restaurant, about the words that had made her cry, about the reminder that they were not invisible after all. Emma was too young to understand everything, but she was old enough to recognize kindness. Rachel wanted her daughter to grow up knowing that good people existed in the world, that even in the hardest moments, there were strangers willing to shine a little light into someone else's darkness. When she finally reached her apartment, the lights inside were dim and Emma was already asleep on the couch, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Rachel's heart softened at the sight. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead and pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek. Emma stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep, and then settled again. Rachel whispered softly, "I love you, my little one," before lifting her carefully and carrying her to bed. After tucking Emma beneath the blanket, Rachel sat at the small kitchen table with the note in her hand. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She unfolded the paper once more and let her eyes rest on the words. They were simple, yet they carried a power she could not fully explain. For the first time in a long time she felt seen, felt understood, felt worthy of something more than just surviving each day. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they did not come from despair. They came from a strange, unfamiliar place, hope. It was fragile, but it was there, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long night. Rachel knew that tomorrow would not suddenly be easier. She would still wake up early, still struggle with bills, still carry trays and smile through exhaustion. But tonight had reminded her of something she had forgotten. She was strong and she was not as invisible as she thought. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to leave behind words that touched her soul, and sometimes that was enough to keep moving forward. As she folded the note again and placed it carefully into her wallet, Rachel whispered softly to herself, "I can do this." The words were small, but they echoed loudly in the quiet apartment, wrapping around her like a shield against the loneliness. She turned off the light, climbed into bed, and let the exhaustion finally pull her into sleep. And somewhere in the silence of the night, Rachel carried with her the memory of a man who had been more than just a customer, who had been a silent observer, and who had given her a gift she would treasure for the rest of her life. Rachel woke up the next morning to the sound of Emma's laughter echoing softly through their small apartment. It was a gentle sound, one that seemed to push back the heaviness of her dreams. For a moment she lay still, letting the sound sink into her heart, reminding her why she carried herself through the endless hours at the restaurant. Emma's voice was the melody that guided her every step, the reason she never gave up even when her body wanted to collapse. She rose quietly, stretching her sore muscles, and walked toward the kitchen. Emma was sitting at the table, swinging her little legs back and forth, humming as she drew on a piece of scrap paper with crayons. Her small fingers clutched a red crayon tightly, moving it across the page with serious focus. Rachel smiled, brushing her daughter's hair gently. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered. Emma looked up, her wide eyes sparkling, and grinned. "Morning, Mommy." That simple greeting gave Rachel the strength to face another day. She began preparing a simple breakfast, toast and scrambled eggs, while Emma continued to hum, lost in her drawings. As she cracked the eggs into the pan, Rachel's mind wandered back to the night before, back to the folded piece of paper now tucked safely in her wallet. She had read it more than a dozen times before going to bed, and even now the words played over and over in her head. She had carried countless trays, heard countless orders, endured countless unkind remarks, but never had she received something like that note. It was not just kindness. It was recognition, the kind she had not felt in years. At breakfast, Emma proudly showed her mother the drawing she had made. It was a simple picture of the two of them holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Rachel felt her throat tighten as she looked at it. To Emma, this picture was just a child's creation, but to Rachel it was a reminder of the bond that held her together, the reason she worked tirelessly. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "It's beautiful, baby, just like you." Later that morning, after dropping Emma off at school, Rachel caught the bus to work. The ride was crowded, filled with strangers staring out of windows or scrolling through their phones. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her mind caught between the struggles of daily life and the memory of the man's words. She wondered if she would ever see him again, or if he had simply been a passing angel in her life, someone meant to deliver a message and then vanish. When she arrived at the restaurant, she slipped on her apron, tied her hair back, and stepped into the familiar chaos. The day unfolded much like the one before. Customers rushing in, orders piling up, the kitchen ringing with noise. Yet Rachel moved through it differently now. Her body was still tired, her feet still sore, but she felt a faint lightness inside, like an invisible hand guiding her forward. As the hours passed, she kept reaching into her pocket, touching her wallet, knowing the note was still there. Just the thought of it was enough to steady her when someone snapped impatiently or when a table left a mess for her to clean. She reminded herself that she was not invisible, not forgotten, and that at least one person had seen her. The evening crowd began to fill the restaurant, laughter rising, voices overlapping, and plates clattering against the tables. Rachel moved gracefully among them, carrying food, refilling glasses, and offering her practiced smile. But inside, she carried something far stronger than just a routine. She carried hope. Then came the moment that changed everything again. Near the end of her shift, as she walked past one of the booths to deliver a tray of drinks, her eyes caught sight of something on the edge of a table. Another folded piece of paper. Her heart skipped. She froze for a brief second, her breath caught in her chest. Before she reached down and picked it up, her hands shook just as they had the night before. Could it be from him again? Was he here? She looked around quickly, scanning the tables, but she did not see his face anywhere. The room was full of strangers, laughing and eating, none of them paying attention to her. Rachel clutched the note tightly and slipped it into her pocket, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. She had work to finish, but her mind was no longer on the trays or the orders. Her thoughts spun wildly, her curiosity burning stronger with every passing second. When her shift finally ended and the restaurant lights dimmed for closing, Rachel slipped into the break room. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the folded paper and opened it slowly, afraid and hopeful at the same time. Her eyes scanned the handwriting and the words carved themselves into her heart. "You are stronger than you think. Never let the world make you forget your worth. Keep going, because one day your daughter will look at you and see the hero you really are." Rachel gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Tears filled her eyes, blurring the words, but she did not need to read them twice to understand their meaning. She sank into the nearest chair, her shoulders shaking as the tears spilled freely down her cheeks. For so long she had carried the weight of the world alone, convinced that no one noticed that her struggle was hers and hers alone. But now, twice in 2 nights, she had been reminded that someone saw her strength, someone valued her courage, someone believed in her. She wept quietly, not out of despair but out of relief. These were not the tears of a woman broken by exhaustion. They were the tears of a woman reminded that her life had meaning. She thought of Emma again, of her bright eyes and innocent smile, and the truth of the note struck deeper. One day Emma would understand. One day Emma would see all the nights Rachel had worked, all the sacrifices she had made, and she would know. She would know that her mother was a fighter, a provider, and above all, a hero. Rachel folded the note carefully, pressing it to her chest for a moment before placing it alongside the first one in her wallet. 2 treasures more valuable than money, because they carried hope, kindness, and a reminder of her own strength. She wiped her tears, stood tall, and walked out of the restaurant into the night. The air felt different, lighter, fresher, as though the world itself had shifted in some small way. For the first time in a long while, Rachel smiled, not the forced smile she gave to customers, but a real one, born from the warmth spreading in her heart. She had no idea if she would ever meet the man again, no idea if there would be more notes or if he had already disappeared from her life, but it no longer mattered. What mattered was that she believed again, believed in her strength, believed in kindness, and believed in tomorrow. Rachel walked home that night with the cool air brushing against her face. Her body tired but her heart strangely awake. She clutched her bag close, where inside her wallet lay the 2 folded notes. They felt heavier than anything she had carried from the restaurant, heavier even than the trays stacked with plates and glasses. And yet it was a weight she did not mind. It was a weight that reminded her of her worth. She thought about the words she had read, about the way they seemed to reach inside her chest and lift the pieces of her that had been crumbling for so long. For the first time in years, she felt like she had been given something more valuable than money: acknowledgement. When she reached her apartment, Emma was still awake, sitting on the couch with her teddy bear tucked tightly under her chin. The babysitter had already left, and the little girl's eyes lit up as soon as she saw her mother. "Mommy, you're home," she squealed, rushing into Rachel's arms. Rachel bent down, hugging her tightly, breathing in the sweet scent of her daughter's hair. For a moment, the world fell away, and it was just the 2 of them, clinging to each other in the small apartment they called home. After tucking Emma into bed and watching her drift off to sleep, Rachel returned to the kitchen. She sat at the small wooden table, pulled the notes out of her wallet, and placed them side by side. Her tears came quickly, spilling over before she could stop them. She covered her face with her hands and let herself cry, the sound soft but filled with years of hidden pain. These were tears she had not allowed herself to shed for a long time. She had always needed to be strong for Emma, always needed to smile when she wanted to break, always needed to push forward no matter how much she hurt inside. But now, sitting alone at the table with the 2 notes in front of her, she finally allowed herself to release the weight she carried. Her mind traveled through the years of struggle. She remembered the nights Emma was just a baby, crying endlessly, and she had sat in the dark rocking her while holding back her own tears. She remembered the day her husband had left, the cold silence that followed, and the crushing realization that she would have to raise her daughter alone. She remembered every bill that had arrived when there was no money to pay it, every pair of shoes Emma had outgrown that she could not afford to replace right away, every meal she had skipped so Emma could eat. Each memory pressed against her heart, but now, instead of breaking her, they reminded her of how far she had come. The words on the notes echoed in her mind. "You are stronger than you think. Never forget your worth. Your daughter will see the hero you are." She whispered them aloud, her voice trembling but steadying with each repetition. They were not just sentences on paper anymore. They were truths she needed to believe. They were reminders that her fight was not invisible, that her sacrifices mattered, that her love for her daughter was shaping something far greater than she could see right now. As the tears slowed, Rachel reached out and touched the notes gently, almost as if they were sacred. Her chest rose with a long breath, and she sat back in the chair. She felt lighter, freer, as though the act of crying had washed away some of the weight she carried. Her eyes were still red and swollen, but for the first time they shone with something other than exhaustion. They shone with hope. The next day at the restaurant, Rachel noticed something different in herself. She still moved through the busy dining room, still carried trays, still faced rude comments and impatient customers, but her smile felt less forced. She noticed small details she had ignored before, the way the light from the chandeliers reflected against the glasses, the way the hum of conversations created a rhythm like background music, the way laughter from one table seemed to ripple across the room. She no longer felt as invisible. She carried herself with quiet strength, and though most people still did not see it, she did. And that made all the difference. Throughout the day, she found herself reaching into her apron pocket, touching her wallet just to feel the notes inside. They had become her shield, her silent encouragement, her invisible companion reminding her she was not alone. She did not know if the man who wrote them would ever return. Part of her wanted to see him again, to thank him, to tell him how much his words had meant. Another part of her accepted that perhaps he had already given her everything she needed, and that it was enough. When the evening shift ended, Rachel walked home again, tired but not broken. She opened the door to find Emma running toward her, laughing with joy. Rachel scooped her up into her arms, spinning her gently, her heart swelling with love. She whispered into her daughter's ear, "One day, sweetheart, you'll understand how hard I fight for you." Emma giggled, not fully understanding, but her little arms wrapped tighter around her mother's neck. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Rachel sat once more at the kitchen table with the 2 notes spread out in front of her. Her tears returned, but this time they were different. They were not the tears of a woman crushed by the weight of life, but the tears of a woman who had finally been reminded of her own strength. She cried because she had been seen, because she had been reminded that her sacrifices were not meaningless, because she had been given the courage to keep going. Rachel wiped her eyes, folded the notes carefully, and tucked them back into her wallet. She whispered softly to herself, "I can do this. I will keep going. For Emma. Always for Emma." And with that, she turned off the light, climbed into bed, and let sleep come with a heart that, though still weary, was now filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. The following days passed with the rhythm of life Rachel had grown used to. Wake up before dawn, prepare Emma for school, work through endless hours at the restaurant, and come home long after dark. Yet something inside her had shifted. The weight on her shoulders had not disappeared. The bills were still there, her body was still tired, but her spirit felt lighter. Each morning, as she pulled on her worn shoes and tied her hair back, she would glance at the notes tucked safely in her wallet. Just knowing they were there gave her strength. They were proof that her efforts mattered, that she was not invisible, that someone believed in her. At the restaurant, her co-workers noticed the subtle change in her. She smiled a little more easily, laughed softly at small jokes, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. She still worked just as hard, her hands moving quickly to clear plates and deliver meals, but there was a glow in her eyes that had been missing. She no longer felt like she was simply surviving. She felt like she was living with purpose again. Then came the night that would etch itself permanently in her memory. The evening crowd filled the restaurant, voices overlapping into a noisy hum as people enjoyed their meals. Rachel was busy balancing trays and offering her usual polite greetings. When she turned to serve a table near the window, her breath caught in her throat. Sitting there, calm and steady as ever, was the man. Her heart raced. For days she had wondered if she would ever see him again, if perhaps he had only been a fleeting figure in her life. Yet here he was, seated at a table with the same composed expression, his eyes following her with that same quiet understanding she remembered. Rachel approached, her hands trembling slightly, but she steadied herself. "Good evening," she said softly, her voice almost catching. "It's good to see you again." He gave a small smile and nodded. "Good evening." She took his order, her heart still pounding, and hurried to the kitchen. As she moved through the restaurant, she felt the weight of his presence in the room. He was not just another customer. He was the one who had reminded her of her worth, the one who had lit a spark of hope inside her. She wanted to say thank you, to tell him how much his words had meant, but the words seemed too heavy to form. She was afraid her voice might break if she tried. When she returned with his meal, he looked up at her and spoke quietly. "How are you doing?" The question startled her. Customers rarely asked about her. They asked about the food, about the service, about the menu, but never about her. She hesitated, unsure of how much to say. Finally, she whispered, "I'm doing better. Thank you." Their eyes met for a moment longer, and then she stepped back, giving him space. Throughout the night, Rachel found herself stealing glances at him as she worked. He did not demand attention, did not act entitled, did not rush her. He simply ate calmly, occasionally looking around the room, but often watching her as though he could see the weight she carried and the strength it took to keep moving. When he finished his meal, Rachel approached to clear the table. Once again, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her heart leapt as he placed it gently on the edge of the table along with the bill. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and he gave her a steady look that seemed to speak louder than words. "Thank you for your kindness," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, and with that, he stood and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a silence that seemed to linger, even after the door closed. Rachel hurried to the back room, her hands shaking as she unfolded the note. Inside was a simple message: keep believing in yourself. You are not alone in this world. Your strength is inspiring even to strangers. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed the paper to her chest, but when she looked closer, she noticed something else tucked inside the folded note: cash. Not just a generous tip, but an amount that nearly made her gasp. It was enough to cover the bill waiting on her kitchen counter, enough to buy Emma the new shoes she desperately needed, enough to give them breathing space for the first time in months. Rachel sank into a chair, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face. The money was important, yes, but what moved her more was the thought behind it. This was not charity, not pity. This was someone recognizing her struggle and choosing to help without asking for anything in return. It was a gift beyond words, one that reached deeper than her empty wallet. It touched her heart, her soul, her very sense of being. That night when she walked home, the city lights seemed to glow brighter, the night air fresher. She clutched her bag close, holding the note as though it were the most precious treasure in the world. When she opened the apartment door, Emma ran into her arms as always, laughing with pure joy. Rachel lifted her daughter high, spinning her around, tears still shining in her eyes. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, Rachel sat once more at the small kitchen table. She placed the 3 notes side by side, smoothing them gently with her hands. She stared at them for a long time, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. For years she had felt invisible, unnoticed and unappreciated. Now these 3 pieces of paper reminded her that her fight mattered, that her strength was seen, that her love for her daughter was building a future brighter than she realized. She whispered softly into the quiet room, "Thank you. Whoever you are, thank you." And with that, Rachel made a promise to herself. She would keep moving forward, not just for Emma, but for herself too. She would hold on to the belief that her life had meaning, that her sacrifices were shaping something beautiful, that even in the darkest nights, there were strangers willing to shine a light. The gift she had received was not just money or kind words. It was the restoration of her spirit, the reminder of her worth, and the courage to keep walking her path with her head held high. The days that followed seemed different for Rachel, though nothing on the surface had changed. She still worked long hours at the restaurant, still wore the same uniform that had faded slightly with too many washes, still rode the crowded bus each morning and night. Yet inside something had shifted. The notes were always with her, tucked carefully in her wallet, and every time her hand brushed against them, she felt a quiet strength rising in her chest. It was as though those simple words had built a shield around her heart, protecting her from the sharp edges of the world. Her co-workers began to notice it too. They saw the way she carried herself now, the way her smile no longer seemed forced but genuine, the way her voice carried a new steadiness when she spoke to customers. She no longer seemed invisible in the restaurant. She seemed alive, present, and quietly confident. Even when faced with rudeness or impatience, she no longer felt crushed. Instead, she reminded herself of the stranger's words, of the belief he had given her. One evening, after finishing a particularly exhausting shift, Rachel walked home with Emma by her side. Her daughter skipped along the sidewalk holding her mother's hand, her laughter ringing through the quiet street. Rachel looked down at her and felt a rush of pride. Emma did not yet understand the depth of her mother's struggles, but one day she would. One day she would look back and realize how hard her mother had fought for her, how much love had been poured into every meal, every pair of shoes, every night of comfort in their small apartment. And when that day came, Rachel wanted Emma to see not just a tired waitress, but a woman who never gave up. That night, after Emma had gone to sleep, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with the 3 notes spread in front of her. She read them slowly, tracing the words with her fingertips, letting them sink deeper into her heart. They had become more than paper. They had become promises. Promises that she was stronger than she believed, that she was not invisible, that she was a hero in her daughter's eyes. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of renewal. She thought about the man who had written them. Who was he really? Why had he chosen her? Perhaps he had seen in her something that reminded him of his own struggles. Or perhaps he simply believed in showing kindness to strangers. She might never know the reason, but she realized it no longer mattered. What mattered was what he had given her. He had reminded her of her own worth, something she had nearly forgotten. He had planted a seed of hope inside her, one that would continue to grow long after he was gone. Over the weeks that followed, Rachel began to make small changes. She applied for a new position at the restaurant, one that paid slightly better. She began setting aside a little money each week, determined to create a small savings for Emma's future. And most importantly, she began to believe in herself again. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw only exhaustion. She saw resilience. She saw a woman who had faced abandonment, loneliness, and poverty, yet had continued to rise every day for the sake of her daughter. One afternoon, as she walked Emma home from school, her daughter slipped her hand into hers and looked up with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy," Emma asked softly, "why do you always smile now?" Rachel stopped for a moment, her heart tightening. She bent down, kissed her daughter's forehead, and whispered, "Because I have a reason to." Emma tilted her head, confused, but then she smiled and nodded, accepting the answer. For Rachel, that moment was more precious than words. It was a reminder that children see more than we realize. Emma had noticed the change in her mother, had felt the warmth of her renewed spirit, and that was enough. Later that night, Rachel sat once again at the table, the notes still her most treasured possession. She thought about how far she had come, how close she had been to giving up inside, and how one stranger's kindness had reminded her of her strength. Life was still not easy, and she knew it never would be completely smooth. But now she had hope. Now she had courage. Now she had a renewed spirit that would carry her forward no matter what came. Rachel whispered into the quiet room, as though speaking to the stranger even though he was not there. "You saved me in ways you'll never know. Thank you." And as she folded the notes once more and placed them carefully in her wallet, Rachel knew she was ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. She was no longer the woman who moved through life invisible and unseen. She was a mother, a fighter, and a woman with a spirit that could not be broken. From that night forward, every step she took was lighter, every smile more genuine, every word filled with strength. And though she might never see him again, the man who had given her those notes remained with her always, in her heart, in her hope, and in the renewed spirit that would guide her for the rest of her life.